Wait! Eleanor! Stop! Stay down! Stay down, you don't put your hands near her. The elevator. Don't let her shut your mouth. This is assault!
He tried to tell them 3 times. What they didn't know, what they never bothered to find out, was exactly who was doing the warning.
Don't get in that elevator. At 8:52 on a gray Thursday morning in downtown Cleveland, a 61-year-old black man in a coat held together with 2 safety pins came running across the marble lobby of the Marwick Tower, dragging his bad left leg, and the first thing 14 well-dressed strangers decided about him was that he was dangerous. He was shouting something. His voice cracked on the high note of it, the way an old engine catches before it turns over, and the words came out shredded by the distance and the panic. Most of the people near the elevator bank heard only the shape of a large man yelling and moving fast toward a small woman in a cream-colored coat. They did what people do. They assumed the worst about him in under a second, and not one of them stopped to ask why. Bradley Kerr was 29, and he had been an assistant shift supervisor in building security for exactly 7 months, and he had been waiting his whole short career for a moment that would let him be a hero in front of the right people. He saw the old man. He saw Mrs. Eleanor Vance, wife of the chairman whose firm occupied the entire 34th floor, standing at the open doors of car number 3 with her travel mug and her leather satchel. And Bradley made his decision before his brain finished forming the thought, which is the most expensive thing a man can do. He crossed the floor in 4 strides and drove his shoulder into Walter Bishop's chest. The old man went down hard, his cheek slapping the cold, polished stone, his cane skittering away under a bench like something alive trying to escape. "Stay down," Bradley said, kneeling on him, wrenching one thin arm up behind his back until the shoulder ground in its socket. "Stay down. You don't put your hands near her. You understand me?" The lobby had gone the particular silence of people who are recording instead of helping. 17 phones were already up. "Elevator," Walter said into the floor, his breath fogged against the stone. "Don't let her. Shut your mouth." Brad pressed harder. Eleanor Vance had backed against the brushed steel panel beside the doors, one hand at her throat, her travel mug shaking enough to spill coffee over her knuckles. And what she felt was not gratitude toward the young man pinning the stranger down, but a pure animal fear that had no shape and needed none. She looked at the old man's face. She would spend a long time later trying to describe to herself what she saw in it, and the closest she ever came was this. He did not look angry, and he did not look crazy, and he did not look like a man who wanted anything from her at all. He looked like a man watching a clock only he could see. "Ma'am, you're okay," Bradley called over his shoulder, performing it now, because the cameras were rolling and his supervisor was somewhere on the mezzanine, and this was the moment. "I got him. You go on up." She turned toward the open doors of car number 3. What happened next took less time than it takes to read this sentence. Walter Bishop made a sound that was not a word, got one knee under himself against every pound of the young man's weight, and lunged, not at the woman, but across her, his whole ruined body thrown like a sandbag into the gap between Eleanor Vance and the elevator. His shoulder caught her at the hip and folded her sideways into the planter. They went down together in a tangle of limbs and spilled coffee, and the satchel bursting open across the marble. Bradley was screaming about assault. 3 men were moving in now to help him. Then car number 3 exploded. To understand what happened in that lobby, why an old man would throw the last working parts of his body in front of a woman who had walked past him every morning for 11 months without once turning her head, you have to go back. You have to know who Walter Bishop actually was, because nobody in that building had bothered to find out. They had a word for him instead. The maintenance crew called him the doorway guy. The morning baristas called him Coat. Bradley Kerr, in the incident logs he typed up with 2 fingers and great satisfaction, called him the Vagrant. His name was Walter James Bishop. And in 1995, he had stood on the roof of the Marwick Tower in a hard hat with the Hollis Elevator Company logo on it and signed the certification that put all 6 of its elevators into service. He was 30 years old that year, the youngest lead commissioning engineer the company had ever promoted, and he was the only black man in a photograph of the project team that still hung, until recently, in a frame on the 18th floor. He had personally tuned the traction machines for cars 1 through 6. He had wound replacement field coils with his own hands during a brownout in 2003 because the contractor they flew in didn't show. He knew those machines the way a man knows the breathing of someone he sleeps beside. He knew their sounds. That was the thing the doctors could never quite take from him, even after everything else went. The leg they couldn't fix, the back that locked up in cold, the tremor that had crept into his right hand. All of that the years had charged him for, but the ear stayed. 31 years of standing in machine rooms with his palm flat against a hummingbird, learning the difference between a healthy growl and the first faint complaint of a bearing starting to fail, had built something in him that no amount of bad luck could repossess. He could stand on the sidewalk outside a building and tell you which of its elevators needed grease. People thought that was a party trick, back when he had people, back when there were dinner tables to do tricks at. Marion had loved that about him. His wife of 26 years used to make him do it at the cinema, at the mall, lean close and whisper which escalator was about to throw a step. She died on a Tuesday in November, 19 months before that Thursday in the lobby, after the ovarian cancer came back a 3rd time and stopped negotiating. The hospital bills came to $46,300 to her. What the insurance refused, and the insurance refused a great deal, and Walter paid what he could and the rest followed him like a dog. Then Hollis Elevator, the company he gave his working life to, was bought by a private equity group 11 months before he reached his full pension, and the new owners discovered a clever way to fold the pension fund into a restructuring, and the courts were still arguing about it, and the checks simply stopped. There was no single catastrophe. That is the part people get wrong about how a man ends up on the sidewalk. It is almost never one big thing. It is 40 small things, and the absence of anyone whose job it is to catch you. By the spring, he had given up the apartment. By the summer, he had given up pretending he was fine. He drifted back, the way wounded animals do, to the one place in the city where he had once been certain of his own worth, and he started sleeping in the recessed doorway of the loading entrance on the east side of the Marwick Tower, where the warm air from the building's mechanical systems leaked out through a louvered vent at height. He did not beg much. He kept a notebook and a stub of carpenter's pencil, and he kept himself as clean as a man can keep himself from a gas station sink, and he kept his ear pressed without meaning to the building he had helped raise. Which is how, 6 days before the explosion, Walter Bishop started hearing the thing that was going to kill someone. It began as a wrongness so small that no one without his particular history could have caught it. He was sitting against the wall by the vent at a little after 6 in the morning, the city still blue and half asleep, when the traction machine for car number 3 came up to speed and sang him a note that did not belong. Healthy gear made a sound like a held breath, steady, almost bored. This had a thin edge riding on top of it, a high harmonic that came and went, the sound a thing makes when it is being asked to do its job through a fault it is trying to route around. He sat up. He turned his good ear toward the louvers. He listened to it cycle 11 times before the morning traffic drowned it. He told himself it was the cold. He told himself he was an old man on a sidewalk imagining he still mattered to the machines inside. But the next morning it was there again, a little louder, and now there was a second sign, the one that made the hair stand up on his arms. Every so often he heard a sharp electrical snap from deep in the riser, a relay slamming closed, and then the high note would clear for a few seconds before it came creeping back. He knew exactly what that was. That was a ground fault relay tripping and resetting itself over and over, a safety device politely raising its hand again and again while someone upstairs kept ignoring it. And under all of it, faint but unmistakable when the loading door swung open, was the smell. Ozone, sharp and metallic, the smell of air being torn by electricity, and braided through it, sweeter and far worse, the smell of varnish cooking off copper windings, the smell of insulation breaking down, the smell, to a man who had spent his life in machine rooms, of a fire that had not started yet, but had already bought its ticket. Walter Bishop knew what was happening in that building as clearly as if he were standing in the machine room with a meter in his hand. Somebody had modernized the elevators, and somebody had done it cheap. Now a drive cabinet was failing toward an arc flash. He did not know the details yet, the $1.2 million bid that the building's operations manager, a soft pink man named Doug Pierce, had quietly carved down to $740,000 by switching to a contractor called Apex Vertical Solutions, whose lowest crew had set the variable frequency drive for car 3 on an undersized ground and left a lug a quarter turn shy of torque. He didn't need the details. He had the sound, the snap, and the smell, and those three things together meant that one day soon, when the load was just right and the fault finally won its long argument with the relay, the inside of that drive cabinet was going to turn into a 35,000-degree ball of plasma. He had seen the aftermath of one once in Akron in 1998. He still saw it some nights. So he did the only thing a decent man can do with knowledge like that. He tried to tell somebody. The first time, he waited until the morning rush thinned and walked up to the front desk with his cane and his notebook, and he asked, very politely, to speak to whoever ran building maintenance, because he believed one of the elevators had a serious fault. The day shift guard looked at his coat, looked at his shoes, and told him the building wasn't hiring. Walter said he wasn't looking for work. He was looking to warn them. The guard told him to have a nice day in the voice people use when they mean the opposite, and a second guard appeared at his elbow, and Walter, who had learned the precise geometry of how these things escalated, left before it could. The second time, 3 days later, he caught Bradley Kerr crossing the plaza on his break, and this was the worst luck of all, because Bradley was exactly the kind of young man who needed someone beneath him to be sure of his own altitude. Walter explained as plainly as he could. He used the simplest words. He said, car 3, he said, the motor's wrong, he said, you've got an electrical fault and it smells like it's getting hot. You need to take it out of service and call a real inspector today. Bradley listened with a small smile that never reached his eyes, and when Walter finished, the young man leaned in close enough that Walter could smell his energy drink and said, here's a tip, Chief. You don't get to come scare the tenants with your little story, so they hand you a sandwich. I see you near those doors again. I'm calling Cleveland PD and telling them exactly what you look like. We both know how that phone call ends. He let that sit. Then he straightened his jacket and walked back inside, and that afternoon he opened the incident log and typed, with 2 fingers, vagrant loitering near elevators, attempting to alarm tenants, advised to leave, before he added the word handled and felt good about himself. The third time, Walter didn't get to use words at all. He had been standing by the louvered vent at dawn with his hand flat against the cold brick. Flat against the cold brick, feeling the vibration come up through the wall, and what he felt frightened him so badly that he went around to the front without thinking it through. And there was a porter hosing down the morning grime on the sidewalk, and the porter saw the old man coming and turned the hose on him, casually, the way you'd shoo a pigeon, and the cold water went down inside his collar and soaked the notebook in his pocket where he had drawn, in careful pencil, a diagram of the drive cabinet and circled the exact place he believed the fault lived. The ink of the date ran. The drawing survived. Walter stood there dripping in 28-degree air, while 2 people on their way to work laughed, and he understood fully and finally that there was no door in that building that would open for him. Not because the danger wasn't real, because the man carrying the warning was the wrong kind of man, he believed. He went back to his doorway. He dried the notebook against his chest, and he made a decision that no one had any right to ask of him, a decision that cost more than anyone watching would have understood, which was this: he would not leave. He would stay by that vent, in the cold, and he would keep his ear on car 3, and when the day came, and he knew it was coming, he could hear it coming the way you can hear a train you can't yet see. He would do whatever a broken old man could do to get whoever was standing there away from those doors. He had failed to save Marion. He had not been able to make the right people listen then, either, in the bright hospital rooms with the men in good coats who used long words and short patience. He was not going to stand at another set of doors and listen to it happen. For 6 days he kept that watch. He grew thinner. The cough that lived in his chest got worse, and on the morning of the 6th day, at 8:50, Walter Bishop heard the climb to a pitch he had been praying he would never hear, heard the relay snap and, for the first time, failed to reset, and felt the smell roll out of the louvers thick enough to taste. He knew he had minutes, maybe less. He got his cane under him. He ran. The explosion did not sound like the movies. People always say that afterward, and it's true. It was not a boom so much as a single enormous flat crack like the whole sky being slapped, followed instantly by a roar of pressure that turned the lobby's air solid for half a second, and blew the polished steel doors of car number 3 off their tracks and across 40 feet of marble. A column of orange fire and black smoke punched out of the open shaft where the car had been waiting. The chandelier over the seating area swung wild on its chain. Every one of the 17 phones that had been recording an old man being subdued by a brave young security guard caught instead a wall of light and the sound of grown adults screaming, and then most of them caught nothing because their owners dropped them and ran. Walter Bishop and Eleanor Vance were on the floor behind the granite planter, tangled together, when the heat went over them like a wave going over a stone. The planter took worst of it. The cream coat caught a fine spray of glass. The old man had his arm thrown across the back of the woman's head, and he kept it there through the second smaller blast and the rain of seeing tile, and he only let go when the alarm started and the sprinklers opened up and turned the whole disaster into something colder and slower and survivable. He had been right about everything. The drive cabinet for car 3 had finally lost its argument. The arc flash had vaporized a section of copper bus and ignited the cabinet, and the fireball had vented straight up the shaft and out the open doors into the lobby, where, 3 seconds earlier, Eleanor Vance had been about to step inside. The car was empty. The shaft was a chimney of fire, and the only person in the building who had known it was coming was lying on the floor in the water, coughing blood-flecked spit onto the marble he used to wax in 1995, with a young security guard's knee print still bruising into his chest. It took the Cleveland Division of Fire 11 minutes to get the lobby blaze knocked down and another 20 to be sure the shaft wasn't going to reignite. They evacuated the tower. They cordoned the plaza. And in the controlled chaos of the next hour, 2 things happened that began to turn the story inside out. The first was small. As the paramedics worked on the old man, and they worked on him for real now because a fireball does not care who you assumed someone was, Eleanor Vance refused to be led away. She sat on the wet marble in her ruined coat with one shoe gone, and she would not stop looking at the stranger on the backboard. "He pushed me out of the way," she kept saying, "to anyone. To no one. He didn't attack me. He pushed me out of the way. He was trying to tell us." Bradley Kerr was nearby, giving a statement to a fire lieutenant, and she heard him describing how he had restrained a violent transient who'd lunged at a tenant, and she stood up in her socks and crossed the floor and said, in a voice that came out far steadier than she felt, "That is not what happened, and you know it is not what happened, and there are 17 videos that say it is not what happened." The lieutenant looked from the woman to the young man. He started writing more carefully. The second thing was not small at all. The fire investigators needed the maintenance records, and the maintenance records, by code, lived in a steel cabinet bolted to the wall of the machine room on the roof, and bolted next to it, because Walter Bishop had insisted on it in 1995, and the building had simply never taken it down, was the original commissioning binder. A senior state elevator inspector named Raymond Salco went up with the fire marshal to pull the logs. He flipped past the recent entries, the thin and suspicious apex sign-offs that already had his jaw tight, until he reached the back, the founding pages, the certification that proved the system had once been installed right. And there at the bottom of the 1995 acceptance test, in a careful engineer's hand that had not yet learned to shake, was a signature he had seen before. W.J. Bishop, lead commissioning engineer. Hollis Elevator Co. Salko stood very still in the burned-smelling machine room. He was 58 years old. He had come up in the trade in the late 80s, and in his first year, a green apprentice scared half to death. The manual he had been handed to study, the document that taught him and an entire generation of Ohio mechanics how to safely test and certify a traction elevator, had carried that same name on its title page, Bishop. He had assumed, the way you assume about the authors of manuals, that the man was either long dead or living comfortably somewhere with a lake behind his house. He took the binder downstairs himself, instead of sending it with a tech because something was pulling at him that he couldn't name. In the plaza, he found a knot of people around a backboard and a fire lieutenant holding a notebook. He found a security supervisor insisting loudly now that the old Vagrant had a history harassing the building, that it was all documented, that he'd personally logged 3 separate incidents, and he found, taped against the glass of the lobby and replaying on a dozen phones, the bystanders had nervously handed investigators the footage. Salko watched it on a cracked screen held by a shaking barista. He watched the old man come running and shouting toward the doors. He watched the security guard tackle him. He watched the guard tell the woman to go on up. And he watched, in the last full second before the world went white, the same old man tear himself loose and throw his body across her to put her on the floor. Then someone pulled up the older footage. The plaza cameras kept 30 days, and there, time-stamped across the previous week, the investigators found Walter Bishop at the front desk pointing at the elevators. They found him on the plaza explaining something to Bradley Kerr while Bradley smiled and walked away. They found him standing in the cold getting hosed off the sidewalk with his arm raised toward the machine room vent. 3 separate days, 3 separate warnings, all of it captured, all of it ignored, all of it now time-stamped beside the smoking hole car number 3 used to open. Raymond Salko turned to the fire marshal and the lieutenant and the building's operations manager, Doug Pierce, who had arrived gray-faced and was already saying the word lawyer to himself. Salko held up the binder. "The man your people threw on the floor this morning," he said, and his voice carried across the wet plaza, "commissioned these elevators. He wrote the test procedure my inspectors still use. He came to this building 3 times in 6 days to tell you that Car 3 was going to do exactly what it just did, and you turned a hose on him." He let the binder fall open to the signature. "So before anybody in an expensive coat says another word about a violent transient, I want it on the record that this building's only competent safety inspection this week was performed by a homeless man standing on the sidewalk." Bradley Kerr's face did something complicated and final. It went pale, and then it went paler, because Bradley had just remembered with the specific nausea of a man watching his own footprints lead to a crime scene, that he had written it all down. He had logged the warnings as harassment. He had typed handled and meant clever. Every dismissal was in the system in his own words, time-stamped, and the words he had chosen to make himself look diligent were now the most damning testimony against him in the building. He had built the case against himself and signed it. Doug Pierce was already trying to explain about the bid, about value engineering, about how Apex came recommended, and every sentence started made the marshal write faster. They put Walter Bishop in the back of the ambulance with a fractured rib from the young man's knee, a scalp laceration from the planter, smoke in his lungs, and a heart that the paramedics watched with quiet worry on the 4-minute ride to Metro Health. He was awake. He was lucid. When the EMT asked him his name for the chart, he said it fully, Walter James Bishop, and then he closed his eyes and said almost to himself, Car 3. It was always going to be Car 3. The drive was on the wrong ground. The EMT wrote down only the name, but a fire investigator, riding along, wrote down the rest. Eleanor Vance came to the hospital that afternoon. She did not send an assistant. She did not send flowers with a card she hadn't written. She came herself, still in the dress she'd changed into because the cream coat was evidence now, and she sat in a plastic chair in a curtained bay and waited for an old man she had walked past 200 times to wake up enough to talk to her. When he did, he was embarrassed, which broke something in her. He apologized for grabbing her. He actually apologized. He said he hadn't meant to put his hands on her, that he'd tried words first, that words hadn't worked. and she had to put her hand over her own mouth to keep the sound in. "You tried to tell my husband's building you were an engineer," she said, when she could. "And nobody believed you." "Lady," Walter said, gently, without bitterness, which was somehow worse than bitterness, "nobody believes a man who looks like me about anything that matters. I made my peace with that a long time before this week. The trick is, you tell them anyway. You don't get to keep the part of yourself that warns people just because they stopped listening." He coughed. "I couldn't get anybody to listen about my Marion either. I figured the least I could do was not lose another one to a thing I saw coming. She found out the rest in pieces over the following days, because she went looking, and because she had the kind of access that opens records. She found the pension that had been folded into a restructuring and frozen by a court that was in no hurry. She found the $46,000 in medical debt, with his dead wife's name still on it. She found that the man who had certified the elevators in the building bearing her family's name was owed by a chain of corporate decisions no single person would ever take responsibility for. Something close to everything, and had been given nothing, and had repaid that with the only currency he had left, which was the warning no one wanted and the body no one valued thrown between a stranger and a fire. What Eleanor Vance did next, she did not do as charity, and she was careful about that because she had spent enough of her life watching wealthy people perform generosity to know the difference between lifting someone up and standing on them to look taller. She did not hold a press conference. She did not hand him a check on a stage. Instead, she made calls, the unglamorous kind, to a state representative she'd had to dinner and a labor attorney she trusted, and the trustee buried somewhere in the wreckage of the Hollis Pension Fund, and she made his case the way he had made the building's case, plainly and persistently, and people who could actually act, until the frozen pension thawed and the medical debt was challenged, and a settlement began to take shape that would let an old man sleep indoors again. And then, because the part that mattered most could not be wired anywhere, she went down to the loading entrance on the east side of the tower, where he still had a few things in a doorway, and she sat down on the cold concrete next to him, in a suit that cost more than his last apartment's annual rent, and she asked him to tell her about the machines. He did. He told her about the held-breath sound of a healthy motor and the thin edge that rides on top of a sick one. He told her about winding coils by hand brownout in 2003. He told her about Marion and the cinema and the escalators, and he laughed, a real one, the first in a long time, and the laugh turned into a cough, and Eleanor Vance, chairman's wife, sat in the doorway and patted the back of a homeless engineer until it passed, and neither of them found anything strange about it. The building changed, though buildings only change when people are made to change them. Apex Vertical Solutions lost its license in the state of Ohio after the investigation found the undersized ground, the under-torqued lug, and the falsified inspection sign-offs across 2 other buildings. Doug Pierce, who had carved $460, sues zero out of a safety contract to make his quarterly numbers, was gone within a month, and the cost of doing it right the first time turned out to be a great deal less than the cost of the lawsuits. Bradley Kerr was not fired for the explosion, which was not his fault. He was fired for the 3 log entries he had typed with such satisfaction, because a building cannot keep a man whose own diligent record proves he treated a life or death warning as an excuse to feel powerful. He learned, too late to do him any good, contempt leaves a paper trail. And the other 6 elevators of the Marwick Tower were torn down to their controllers and rebuilt right, supervised by an inspector named Raymond Salco, who insisted on one condition that was not in any code. The original commissioning binder, the one with the careful signature in the back, went back up on the 18th floor wall in a new frame, beside a small brass plate that read simply, "Certified by W.J. Bishop," who tried to tell us. Walter Bishop did not die on that marble floor, though it was closer than the paramedics liked. He spent that winter in an apartment with heat that worked, and he started consulting, quietly, for a small firm that did elevator safety audits and could not believe their luck at the name on their letterhead. He was still in pain. The leg never came back. The cough never fully left. But he had a door that locked and a kettle that whistled and, on the wall, a photograph of a woman at the cinema, and most mornings that was enough. Here is the thing I keep turning over, and the reason I'm telling you this at all. There is a version of that Thursday where nobody films and nobody believes, and the old man on the floor stays the vagrant in the log forever. And the only difference between that version and this one is that a fireball happened to prove him right in front of 17 cameras. The truth had been true all week. He had been an engineer all week. The danger had been real all week. The only thing that changed at 8:52 that morning was that it became impossible to keep ignoring him. We did not learn that Walter Bishop mattered. We were forced to. And I don't think we get to feel good about a lesson we only accepted because a man almost burned to death teaching it to us. So I'll leave you with the question I can't put down. How many people are standing at the edge of your day right now, dismissed because of how they look or how they speak or what they appear to be worth, trying to hand you something true? You don't get an explosion to sort them out for you. You just get the choice, every single morning, to look at the person in the doorway long enough to find out who they actually are. If this story moved you, do one thing for me. The next time you walk past someone the world has decided to stop seeing, look at them. Just look. And if you want more stories about the people we overlook and the dignity we owe them, whether they ever pay us back or not, subscribe and stay with me, because there are a lot of doorways in this city, and